Tells the story of a family in South Korea. Sohn is an 8-year-old girl who is still in elementary school. While her parents work to earn a living, the father worked in a factory with his friend named Guangxi. The mother works as a shop owner. But because of that, she did not get more attention from her parents. But she understands that they are looking for money for her and their needs. And also they really love her. Until one morning, when she was getting ready to go to school. There it was raining so heavily, which made she a little late, but her mother followed her from behind. Mother intends to take her to school, but she refuses because she can run to school in just 3 minutes. Hearing this, the mother told her daughter to go through the main road. And as a good child, she also followed her mother's orders. Sohn walked alone. But there, when she almost reached her school, she met an old man who asked her for help. The man asked her to take him somewhere because he was in the rain. Of course, she had rejected it. But because she is a small child who is kind and so innocent, she finally delivered him. But it was there, in the place of an old building, unexpectedly that she was already in a very pathetic state. She was raped very cruelly by the old man. She, who was still in pain, then tried to call 911 with her cell phone, and luckily not long after that, help finally arrived. While both of Sohn's parents were at work, then heard the news about their daughter. They went straight to the place where Sohn was treated. They did not expect that such a terrible thing happened to their daughter. The doctor finally conveyed about Sohn's health. There the doctor said that there were many cuts on her face and there was also a tear in her large anus, so she had to be operated on as soon as possible. The father, who was already in the operating room, had to feel the pain even deeper when he found out that in order for his daughter to survive, the doctor had to remove her anus and large intestine, so she had to use an artificial anus for the rest of her life. With a sad feeling, the father could not help but have to allow the operation, in order to save Sohn. After hours, finally the operation went smoothly. Her parents were finally able to meet their daughter, who was still lying limp, but the mother, who could not bear to see the condition of her daughter, chose to cry outside, leaving the father, who had strengthened his feelings, to meet her daughter. There, while he was sitting looking at Sohn, he gently held her fingers, which made Sohn woke up from her sleep. She asked where the mother was. Her father replied that her mother was guarding outside. Sohn, also as a smart child, began to tell what happened to her a few hours ago. She told about the characteristics of the culprit. She said she was in such deep pain that she called for help because she believed that bad people should be caught immediately. She also said that the reason why she told this, because she was afraid that she would forget if she continued to lie in the hospital. Of course, the father, who had braced himself, couldn't take the pain anymore. He cries very sadly. Meanwhile, the police have managed to find the suspect's fingerprints at the crime scene. But unfortunately, when the father was at the police station, he had to know that the suspect could not be clearly identified. Because the police found several different fingerprints at the crime scene, so that they could not find the real suspect. But the police also said that if Sohn testified, they would immediately arrest the perpetrators. The father, of course, discussed it with his wife first. But the wife very firmly refused it, because the mother did not want her daughter to remember the terrible incident that could make Sohn experience such deep trauma. But when the father said that Sohn wanted to catch the criminal as soon as possible, the mother finally allowed the police, who were accompanied by a child psychiatrist, to start the action. In the treatment room, the psychiatrist brought herself closer to Sohn first. And fortunately that method succeeded in making Sohn want to tell what happened. The police began to open sheet after sheet of photos of possible suspects. And fortunately she immediately appointed one of the suspects, who turned out to be a former prisoner who had been released from prison. It didn't take long for the police to arrest the perpetrator, who was at his house. The father, who already knew that the perpetrator had been arrested, then rushed to the police station. But there it turns out that he was even intercepted by several journalists who already knew about the case that Sohn experienced. It made him immediately run away from there, and luckily after he managed to hide, he again got to know from his friends that journalists had also started looking for information at the Sohn's place of care. The father, who did not want to expose the incident to the media, then returned to the Sohn hospital to be treated. And sure enough, when the Sohn was about to be moved to a certain room, the reporters were already there and immediately saw the Sohn with their parents. Seeing this, the father then immediately carried her daughter to go upstairs. However, because that's what makes the bag where the Sohn excrement is stored, it breaks. The father, who realized this, frantically immediately cleaned it up, but the father forgot to take it into his panic that even made she remember about the gloomy incident. She asked her father to stop, but he continued to make physical contact with Sohn, intending to clean her dirt. And since then the father has felt guilty for what he has done. Even now Sohn no longer wants to have anything to do with strangers, and including her own father. Obviously this made the father hit even more, which prompted him to contact the child psychiatrist who had been helping the police. While the mother turned out to be lying limp because she was pregnant with a second child. Then when the father was paying the hospital bill, he received a message that the perpetrator's trial would begin the next day. It then made the father contact his friend, and although shy, His friend found out that he was in need of borrowed money. Then his friend happily lent him the money he had collected. The father again thanked his friend. The next morning, while his wife was being treated, unexpectedly, his wife's best friend came, who turned out to be Mr. Guangxi's wife. There they chatted more deeply as friends, pour out their hearts to one another. While at the trial, the prosecutor began to tell what happened to the perpetrator, but apparently the perpetrator did not confirm what was said. He keeps lying to the judge. He says that he doesn't remember at all. He was drunk at the time. This clearly made the father not believe what he had heard. And because the prosecutor did not have sufficient evidence, the judge decided to postpone the trial. At the hospital, it turned out that the child's psychiatrist was already there, and she is trying to approach it by using the cartoon character that Son likes, namely Kokomong. There, she clearly liked what she saw. At first glance, Son has become a cheerful child again, which turns out to be the person behind the costume is the mother and also her friend and the police. This made the father realize that to make his daughter smile he had to try on the Kokomong costume. He then tried to borrow the Kokomong costume from the owner, and luckily the owner lent it for free. It then made the father return to Son's room, and of course she liked the costume. Although she did not know that it was her father, but for himself it was more than enough. Because he was able to chat through writing and also managed to hug his beloved daughter. Until one morning, while Son was sitting with a psychiatrist, she finally opened herself up a little further. There she told that she wanted to go back to school. But she again discouraged it because she was ashamed of her friends. In fact, she is also afraid that later she will be the subject of bullying at school. But on the other hand, Guangxi's child, who turned out to be in the same class as Son, said otherwise. He wanted Son to go back to school. He then asked to her friends to paste a letter of encouragement for her in front of the door of her mother's shop. Even parents of Son friends, they raised a little money to give to Son family. Until after days, Son finally started to get better, which prompted the hospital to allow her to go home. The father who had borrowed his friend's car then immediately left from there. But on the way, Son accidentally saw the scene that had happened to her. This made she restless again, which her mother immediately calmed down. When she got home, she was surprised by a lot of paper made by her school friends. There they asked she to go to school immediately, and that's what made she started to venture to go to school, which was followed by her friends from behind. Because she has not been able to make physical contact with her friends. And in the middle of the trip, when Son was being attacked by her restless feelings again, her father was following her from behind to encourage her. Even every day the father, who is still wearing the Kokomong costume, always greets Son in the middle of her school trip. The father also asked the school to pay attention to the state of her more than usual. He also asked male teachers not to make physical contact with her first. Son goes to school with her friend every day. The boy called Guangxi was now even closer than usual. He keeps her from her other friends. This made Guangxi now recognized by Son, who was able to walk close together with her. But on the way, they came back to see Kokomong. Every day the father always followed Son when she came home from school. But because of that, she finally realized that Kokomong was actually her father. She finally started to get closer to her father. She cleaned all the sweat of her father's struggle. Until one day when the father was with the police, he told him that Son had to testify before the judge if she wanted the perpetrator to be punished severely. Because the judge said that the recording of Son at the hospital yesterday could not be considered a valid testimony. Because at that time, she was lying limp. This made the father try to meet the perpetrator at that time. Then he tried to ask directly to the perpetrator. But again the perpetrator did not admit what he had done. He lied for the umpteenth time and even asked the father to make peace and will send a ransom immediately. Especially when the perpetrator said that when he was released later, he would threaten Son again. This clearly made the father angry with the perpetrator. But unfortunately, he must be separated by a wall. Until the day the court's decision finally begins. Son was already there to testify again. There the prosecutor then showed the suspect's photos again. And sure enough, when she was asked to point out the culprit, she again showed the same photo when she was in the hospital, which prompted the defense attorney for the perpetrator to ask again whether Son smelled alcohol from the man, and she answered yes. This resulted in the perpetrator being brought back to court. There again clearly the perpetrator still does not admit what he did. He said that he was drunk at the time. He was not aware of what he was doing that day. And in the end the judge began to decide the verdict that must be borne by the perpetrator. He said that the culprit would be severely punished. But because the perpetrator was declared drunk that day, the judge decided to imprison him for 12 years. Obviously we ourselves even know it's not worth what Son's whole life. It also made everyone in the court disillusioned with the judge's decision. But it can't be helped. The judge has decided it like that. All they could feel now was injustice. Obviously this made the father emotional and he immediately took the nameplate to beat the perpetrator. But fortunately Son managed to hug her father's leg and asked him to come home immediately. Instantly it made the atmosphere in the trial filled with tears of injustice. Until one day after the court's decision, it turned out that Son was living her day normally, along with her father and mother, who turned out to have another little baby.